So Module 10, basic router configurations. So last week we talked about routers themselves, and you guys are supposed to look over, hopefully, router characteristics, the lab I sent home with you if you get to it. If not, we will do that on Monday when you return, and Thursday when my other class returns. But this is now going forward. So you learn about the device, much like we did our switches. And now our next lab is going to be going into the router and learning how to configure that router and make it function the way we want it to function. So basic router configuration. So the main objective here is to implement initial settings on a router and end devices. So like some of you have already seen, if when your router boots up, and you don't say no to that very first question, excuse me, all of a sudden your device starts asking you questions that it thinks you know the answer to. Okay, what is my password? What is this? What is that? So when that happens, your only recourse is to turn the device off and turn it back on. Okay, so you always want to say no to that very first question. And then the second question is in brackets. So anything that is in brackets, we did go over this when we talked about how configurations work on the device, but as a refresher, any answer that is in the bracket is a default answer. So if the default answer is what you want, you simply have to type in, or not even type in anything, just hit enter. That brings us into initial configuration. So this is you getting a device right out of the box. Unless you paid a company to configure that device for you, it only has a basic iOS, okay, with just basic commands which list the different interfaces and things of that nature. So we want to get you into initial configuration so that much like you did with your switches, you are now going in there and you're saying, hey router, this is what I'm naming you. These are the IP addresses for your interfaces. This is how you're going to function. Okay, so that is what you're learning in this very first course. So configure initial router settings is to configure exactly initial settings on an iOS Cisco router. You're going to configure 2 active interfaces on a Cisco iOS router, and you are going to configure the default gateway. So devices use, or devices to use, configure your devices to use the default gateway, which by now you should know is an interface on the attaching router to that LAN. Now, configuring the device's name. And again, some of this is going to be redundant because you've already done some of these functionalities in class with your switch. So the different configurations between routers and switch, there's obviously going to be differences between the two, but for the basic configurations. So somebody asked me a question in one of my classes, I can't remember which one it was. What is considered basic configurations? This slide is a good indication of basic configurations. What you should know verbatim without having to look it up, without trying to do guesswork. You should know how to configure device name. Again, don't forget the dynamic of your commands. So your first parameter is the prompt. Your second parameter is the command itself. And in this first example, the third parameter is the keyword or argument. So the command is host name. I am in global configuration mode, and then I choose a name. As soon as you hit the enter button, as long as your router and even switch understands syntactically the syntax that you have typed in here, then it will execute. So when you hit enter, in this example, the very first thing that should have happened, and I wish I showed this on your slide to you, they did not, is now from here out, your router should be named whatever it is you named it. Secure privilege exec mode. Everyone gets confused about what password they're looking at when they're looking at their device. Your privilege exec mode. I want you to think back to when we first started talking about routers and configuring the routers. How did we get into executive mode, executive privilege from executive user? Of course, we did that by typing in the enable password. Excuse me, the enable word, not password. So, securing your privilege exec mode means to secure somebody from just typing in the word enable and getting into your device. So, enable secret is the command here. Okay, password is what you choose to give it. Your second is your line console 0. So hopefully we all know by now that your console line is the line, it's a physical connection into your device via a router or a switch, and it gains you access into that device to configure that device. We also want to protect that. So let's say we forgot to put an enable secret password on. And so an intruder types in enable. It gets to the next point. Well, the very next point is going to be, well, tell me the password for the console. So if you didn't do an enable secret, but you did do a line console, then it would stand to reason that they still can't get in until they also know the console password. So you go into the appropriate line that you want, and because everything in digital starts with 0, it is line console 0. Excuse me. Again, password is the command, and then you associate with what you want to create here. So get used to, it's kind of hard sometimes on these slides to see, but your keyword and argument is in italics. Okay, so pay attention to that. Okay, it's in the italic font. Now, your line VTY, this is for your virtual line. So line VTY means virtual telecommunication lines. And on a router, you have 0 to 4. On a switch, depending on the model of the switch, it will be 0 to 4 or it will be 0 to 15. So very important concept. So on an exam, if your exam states for you to put a password on your VTY lines and you only do 0 to 4, essentially what you've done is you've only put a password on a few of them. And in that case, you have left the rest of them open for interpretation, meaning a threat actor. So in both circumstances with the line console and the line VTY, okay, you create a password, you have to include the login. If you do not include the login command, you will never be prompted for a password. So your login prompts you for the password. So if you don't have the login, or you forgot to put in the login, when you go to Telnet or SSH into a device, it's not going to let you in. Now that last on the line VTY, and you can also put this on your console line, transport, import, you have a choice of SSH or Telnet. Excuse me. Now, in older models, Telnet was already implemented by default. Excuse me. In newer models or iOSs, you actually have to tell it to do either SSH or Telnet, or if you want both as your input choices, you simply write transport input SSH space Telnet. And you will have the option of either or. Now, when you do that, it will always default to the SSH process first because SSH is a more secure login feature. Once you create your passwords, and incidentally, by the way, in case you don't remember, I'm sure I must have pointed it out, when you type in enable secret, that word secret means encryption. Okay, so that if you were to do a show run after you put in enable secret Cisco being your password, when you do a show run, you're going to see that the password for the enable is a culmination or a combination, excuse me, of letters, numbers, and symbols. Now, to do it all throughout your device is the service password encryption. Service password encryption, and be careful with this because I'm pretty sure in older iOSs now that I'm looking at this, there might be a hyphen in between password dash encryption. We'll find that out when we do the lab. But it is service password encryption. Now, when you do this, it takes every plain text password that you have created and it encrypts it. It encrypts it for not only the current ones on the device, but any that you create going forward. And be careful with this. When you take it off, it does not negate the ones that you already put into encryption mode. Okay, so you can remove it so that going forward, they're not encrypted, but it does not go backwards. Lastly, you provide your legal notification and save the configuration. Banner message of the day is a warning. It carries legal significance. It is saying, hey, you don't belong here, stay out. This is mine. The only parameter with regard to banner message of the day is it has to start with the same meta character and end with the same meta character. So meta characters are those characters that are above the numbers on your keyboard. So you can use any of those, they just have to be the same for the beginning and for the end. So you open a message of the day with a meta character, you then type your message, stay out, and then you end the command with the same meta character. Lastly, when you are satisfied with your configurations, you want to save your configurations. Now, what I want to point out to you here and what you want to pay attention to, don't just fly through these labs, guys. Watch your prompt. So you see for the first one, host name, and you hit enter and hopefully your host name changed, depending on whether or not you did the host name correctly. Remember with host names, no spaces. Okay, so if I want to name my router Charlene Pelsky, I can't type in Charlene space Pelsky. It would not work. I could type in Charlene dash Pelsky. I could type in Charlene _ Pelsky, but no spaces. It is not case sensitive, but you can certainly make it case sensitive if that's how you want to do it. If I want my name to be precise, I would capitalize my C and I would capitalize my P. Now, when you get into line con 0, pay attention to the mode that you're in. I got my pencil, hold on. This is global. You type in line con 0, whichever line you want, you now go into line mode. You need to know these prompts. Okay, so as you're doing this, pay attention. The other thing I want you to do as you're doing these configurations is do a new configuration, do a show run. Where does it show up in the output of the show run? Okay, again, when you're done, you hit the end or the exit, and that will take you back out. So end or exit is going to take you back to privilege. Okay, so you need to stop paying attention to these different prompts and the different modes that you're in. A lot of times when you call me over during lab and you say, I'm typing it in, it's not working, a lot of the chances are you're in the wrong mode. Okay, so utilize that cheat sheet that I gave you and try now to start getting acclimated with the commands and the mode that you execute them in. Commands for basic router configuration. Again, R1's perspective. My host name. Enable my secret. Go into my line. Give it a password. Don't forget login. Line VTY 0 to 4 or 0 to 15, whichever is appropriate. Password Cisco. And if you don't know, by the way, do a show run. Do a show run, go all the way down to the end, and it will tell you how many lines you have on that device. Again, don't forget the login, transport, import. So this is an example of either SSH or Telnet. I can put both like you see here, or I could put one or the other. I type in exit, I go back a prompt. So now back to global, service password encryption, banner message of the day. I enter my message, unauthorized access is prohibited. You could do little stars like this, however you want to do it. And then you end with the same meta character, which kind of looks weird here because your meta character is on one line up here, and then the ending is on the other. Okay, but the message is in the middle. You can do multiple lines if you so wanted to, but it's really not necessary in a lab arena or even when you're doing your project. But do know that you could put multiple lines of a message. One of my students last semester used his from work, and it was just like a paragraph of a warning. I don't want to see that. Okay, know that it is an option, but keep it simple. Basic warning, you don't belong here. Again, I am in global, I hit that exit key, and now I'm back to privilege. This is what I need you to stop paying attention to, okay? When you save your configuration. So, what we're doing right now when we configure our devices is referred to as your running config. So your running configuration lives in RAM. RAM does not keep. If you don't save it, you turn off that device and it is gone. Just like you, if you were working on a Word document and you didn't save the document, you lost power, guess what? Everything is gone, you start again. Same thing here. Running config is lifetime. It is saved in RAM. Your startup config. Now you have a startup config on these devices. That's called that little basic iOS that comes with your devices, where it lists all the different, ports that you have available, the lines that you have available, things of that nature. When I go in here and I do all my basic configurations and I want to save that for the next time my device boots up, I have to copy it to the startup configuration. Your startup configuration lives in non-volatile RAM. Okay? So you don't lose it if something happens. So the command itself, copy running config, startup config. Okay, we did learn in one of our labs that the truncated version, I believe is this. So by typing that, you are essentially telling your router the same thing. Copy the running config to the startup config. So what that term actually means is copy what I'm doing right now to my NVRAM so that when I start up, it is there. Okay, so start identifying what your commands mean. I have given you enough information in those helpful handouts for you to know the differences of what it is you're doing. So when we get into our interface, now interface mode is another mode. So again, I am changing from global to interface. Okay, I'm in global. I type in the command interface. I identify my interface. I now go into interface mode. Okay, and then I do the exact same thing for IP6. Now, a lot of you in lab, again, you've typed in a command. Understand that Cisco does not revamp the labs. We have just in this lab alone, in my other 2 labs, 3 different models of switches, 3 different models of routers. Each one of those routers have different interfaces. So as things progress and got better, as bandwidth was increased, your interfaces also have to increase and get better. So if you type in an interface type and number and excuse me, your device spits out something that says, hey, that interface isn't on this device. I've shown multitude of you how to do this. You need to do, you might even want to do this first before you even start your lab. Do your show IP INT brief command to see what interfaces you have available on that model of device. Now, show run will also tell you the same thing. So if you want to be precise in your labs and just really learn how to get through them, you might want to do this step first. Either or will suffice. Now, it is always good practice to use the description command to add information about the network connected to the device, or the interface, excuse me. Those descriptions do nothing toward the switching capability or the routing capability of the device. They are for us, the administrator. So think back. A router out of the box, a switch out of the box is simply named router or switch. If I simply connect all of them together and they're all named router and or switch, how do I know who's who? Well, we do that with the host name. Now, to make it even easier for us as admins, we say, well, coming off of this router interface F01, this is plugged directly into switch 1, floor 2, closet 3, port 7. Make them something worthy, something that will help you by looking at your show run. I don't have to go to closet 7. I don't have to get on my hands and knees and trace a wire. I know, and of course I'm talking about idealistic, unless somebody messed with your stuff. I know just by looking at my description where that interface is plugged in. The no shutdown command activates the interface. If you don't do if you don't do a no shut and you do that show IP interface brief and your interface shows up as administratively down, you should understand that administratively down, that's you. You didn't do something, you're the admin. So administratively down means you didn't do a no shut on that interface. Your fault. Now, the commands to configure interface G00 on R1 are shown here. Now, this scrolling that you see, again, a couple of you in lab didn't understand that when you plug in when you have a lab and it identifies the switch port you're plugging into, you need to use that port. This is not willy-nilly going forward, okay? Your labs, now in this case, there is no port identified on the switch, so you could plug it into anything, okay, in this circumstance. But this is coming off of your router that you see here, gigabit G000. So I type in my interface, I get into interface mode, I put on my description, and I start to configure my interfaces. I go into interface G00 first, I give it an IP address, a subnet mask, I give it my IPv6 address and its associated prefix, and I do my no shut, I do exit, and I'm back waiting for the next point. Now do understand, if you have multiple interfaces to configure on your device, you don't have to hit exit. You can just type in interface gigabit 001 and be into the next interface. There's no need to go all the way back out to come back in the same mode. Now the scrolling that you see here, this is your device talking to you. Okay, and Cisco One, and there is a way to shut this down because it does come, it does become a pain in the neck. There is a way to shut this down. I don't want you to at this juncture. I want you to look at what it's saying. So this guy is saying, initially when you do a no shut, it tells you that the interface is changed to down. Then it says, oh wait, you did a no shut. A no shut means you want me to turn it up. You want me to turn it on. So then it tells you that the state is changed to up. Okay, that last line is what we're going to learn has to do with different monitoring commands that you will get. You will get there, and we'll speak about it at that time. But this is, again, telling you, okay, it's in an up-down, line protocol on the interface is up. So now, after you do this, maybe you want to do that show IP INT brief, and if you do, in best case scenario, G000 should show as up and up. So that status in that IP INT brief, that is layer 1 and layer 2 statuses. So, am I configured with the correct IP addressing stuff? Am I also active with the correct cable? So up and up is what we want to look for. If you get anything besides up and up, you have to troubleshoot, you have a problem. Now to verify, well, and here it is right here. So to verify interface configuration, you're going to again use that show IP interface brief and show IPv6 interface brief as shown here. So again, what you're looking for, did I give my device, not my device, my interface, did I give my interface not only an IP address, but the correct IP address based on either the diagram that you saw, where everything was listed on the diagram, or the table that you get at the beginning of a lab. The method is manual because you put it in, and the protocol is up and up. Up and up is full functionality. And as you see here, administratively down means if I were using VLAN 1, number one, I didn't assign it, so it's missing an IP address. I also did not turn it on. So in this example, we're not using VLAN 1. But to point it out in the future, if your VLAN is down and you don't know why, it could be because you didn't turn it on. It could be that you didn't put the interface address on there. So multiple different things. So that's why this is referred to as a brief summary of all of your interfaces. This table summarizes some of the show commands. Again, as I stated before we went on break, you need to know your show commands. You need to understand what your show commands give you. Your show commands are your device talking to you, be it a router or a switch. So these are the most popular ones that you'll use over and over again. And as you can see, most commands, or the only difference between commands between IP4 and IP6 is so when we're talking about IP4, we never type in IPv4. IP4 is the standard, okay, before the development of IP6. So show IP INT brief means show IPv4 interface brief. When we want to look at something in the v6 world, we have to actually add that v6 to our command. Now, to view the status, again, is showing your brief or using your brief command. We talked a little bit about this before you left for your vacation. How do I know what my router knows? Your show IP route. So in this example, excuse me, I am looking at the table for things I did in IP4 and things I did in IP6. Because as we spoke again briefly about previous, most companies today are using a dual stacking scenario, meaning they're putting both IP4 and IP6 on the devices. Because we have not segued all the way to IPv6 in totality. So you need to look at both. You have to unfortunately do them separately. Okay? So your first one is looking at what you know in IP4, and we briefly went over what the C means, what the L means. What they're not showing you here is the defining rubric that identifies those things. Okay? But if you were to look at this and go back to the diagram that you used to configure them, you should see that yes, on R1, my gigabit 001, its IP address should be 209.165.200.224. 00. Oh, I'm sorry. So the first one is the directly connected route, IP. It's the directly connected network, is the C. The L is the link address. Okay? A link on your devices is the interface. So a link means interface. So this is going back, the directly connected route. And your L means your link, which means the interface itself. Okay, so that means your L's are always going to promote 32 bits of information, right? In IP4, we know this. IP4 is 32 bits. It's always going to show 128 in IPv6 because IPv6 is 128 bits. This other stuff that you're seeing here that says variably subnetted, when we talk about subnetting. So subnetting is simply the practice of taking what you are assigned, the network number that you are assigned, and breaking it down into smaller networks within your organization. And we will talk about that when we get to chapter 11 next. I could also look at a particular interface. Now, we're looking at interface G000. If you want to look at just one, you identify it like this. if I were to do just show interfaces, you would get every single interface on the device, be it a router or a switch. So when you're looking at this, try to look and understand. It's telling you this is gigabit G00. Its status is up and up. Okay? Up and up. Up and up means we're functioning perfectly fine. The next thing I want you to identify, now it says the hardware here is ISR 4321, so that is the model of the device. The address here is the BIA. You guys just did a lab with this identifying the MAC address. So don't forget, BIA is your MAC address. It is the burned in address. Okay, and one of the things we talked about, or we should have talked about when we talked about our MAC addresses, is they can be displayed in a few different functions. The reason why everybody gets confused about this is not how you learn MAC addresses, right? You learn it like this. Both of those mean the exact same thing. It could also be identified as such. And that last one is not to be confused with an IPv6 address, because an IPv6 address has 8 octets of information. This MAC address only has 6 hextets of information. Other things we've talked about, the description here. Its IP address, the bandwidth, the duplex, the speed, okay, the media type on that cable is an RJ45, and all this other stuff you may or may not touch base with as we go along, okay? You will talk about many of these parameters, okay, but not all of them at this point. And again, I can do the show IP interface G000 as well. When you look at IP, I want you to understand that IP means Internet Protocol. So again, it lists some of the same things. It tells you it's up and up. It tells you the interface's IP address with the subnet mask. It tells you the broadcast address. It tells you the MTU that we just talked about. Okay, let's see what else. And it tells you that fast switching is enabled. Or fast switching is enabled, IP flow switching is disabled. So just different things that you can learn. And same thing for IP6. Now, our default gateway, if you don't know this by now, folks, you might want to rethink your position. Okay, I've talked about this since the very inception of these courses. Your default gateway is used when a host sends a packet to a device on another network, also defined as remote. Your default gateway address is generally the router interface attached to the local network of the host. To reach PC3, PC1 addresses a packet with the IP4 address of PC3, but forwards the packet first to its default gateway. We've talked about this a couple of times now. So the G000 interface of R1 steps in and acts as a proxy to forward it toward the destination. So in this example, R1 G001 is the default gateway for LAN 1. And G001 is the default gateway for LAN 2. So on LAN 2, PC3, PC4, and switch 1 have a default gateway of this. PC 1, 2, and switch 1 on that arena, or we'll call that switch 2 just to be correct. All have the same default gateway as well. Okay, so that's when we talk about networks, they say that your default gateway has to have an address in the same network as. Okay, so up top we have the 192.168.10.0 network, and then below we have the 198.162.11.0 network. So, IP address of the host and the router interface must be in the same network. Now, the reason why I put a default gateway on a switch must have a default gateway address configured to remotely manage the switch from another network. Pretty much that is the only reason why we put an IP address and a default gateway on a switch. To configure an IP4 default gateway on a switch, you use the IP default gateway command with the IP address of, where am I? Oh, with just the IP address of the default gateway. So when you go into interface VLAN 1, it acts just like any other interface. You need the IP address and the subnet mask as you see here. Within the command of IP default gateway, you do not use a subnet mask. You only use the IP address of the default gateway, which we should see is definitely that router's interface. Okay, so hopefully you can get to these before we come again in person next week. Any questions, just email me. Thank you so much.